Have you ever noticed that you walk into a place and feel the tension before anyone speaks? As if the air had weight, even when everyone is smiling. You hear, "Everything's fine," but the person's body screams the opposite. And when you calmly comment on what you felt, they call you intense, paranoid, or dramatic, as if seeing too much were a flaw. Maybe you've started doubting yourself, wondering if you're exaggerating, if you're creating patterns where none exist. But deep down, you know you're not imagining it. You perceive what's behind it. The subtext, the micro-expression, the pause that reveals more than the entire sentence. There is a type of person who doesn't live only on the surface. They feel the atmosphere before understanding the reason. They read micro-signals that others ignore. They detect masks, patterns, contradictions. While many operate at the level of words, they capture what is silent. And that completely changes the way they experience the world. The problem is not that you're inventing things. The problem is that you see what others don't want to see. And when you become that kind of person, you stop being just a participant. You become a mirror. And mirrors are not comfortable for those who live behind masks. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon long before it became popular. He realized that some people develop such differentiated perception that they begin to see unconscious contents in others with unsettling clarity. And this ability, if not integrated, can isolate, exhaust, and even destabilize. Today you will understand why seeing too much can become a gift or a sentence. Why your perception sometimes feels like a superpower and at other times an unbearable burden. And most importantly, why this is not coincidence or fragility, but a deep psychological pattern. But before we continue, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear may change the way you see yourself. Because once you understand what is really happening, you can't return to comfortable ignorance. Once you recognize the pattern, you can no longer unsee it. If you identify with this video will give you clarity and direction. It will show you why this isolates you, why it exhausts you, and how to stop carrying the world on your shoulders. And at the end, I will show you exactly what Jung would tell you to do when your perception starts to destroy you from the inside. There is something about your presence that changes the atmosphere of a room without you saying a single word. You walk in, observe, and within seconds you already perceive what no one is saying, but everyone is feeling. The invisible tension, the wounded pride, the envy masked as friendliness. You don't force it. It simply happens. And that is exactly why it makes people uncomfortable. You notice when someone praises you, but their eyes reveal competition. You hear the joke and feel the disguised aggression. You detect manipulation before the request is even made. While others get distracted by words, you catch the subtext. And that silent reading turns you into something dangerous. A mirror, reflecting what they would rather hide. Carl Jung observed that everything someone cannot bear to recognize in themselves tends to be projected onto others. And when you see too much, you activate this mechanism without meaning to. Your clarity becomes a threat. Not because you accuse, but because you perceive. And perceiving alone is enough to awaken deep discomfort. People don't hate what you do. They react to what you reveal without speaking. Your simple attention exposes inconsistencies. Your calm dismantles performances. Your presence silently asks, "Why are you pretending?" And not everyone is prepared to answer that question. So instead of looking at themselves, they look at you. That's why you've been called intense, exaggerated, or paranoid. Not because you're wrong, but because your perception forces others to face what they try to avoid. Jung would call this shadow projection. When someone cannot tolerate their own truth, attacking the mirror feels easier than facing the reflection. You are not the problem. You are the mirror of the problem, and mirrors do not distort, they only reflect. But reflecting requires courage from the one who looks. Most people would rather blame the surface of the glass than admit what they see. So you become the dramatic one, the critic, the overly sensitive one, all to preserve the collective illusion. Have you noticed how certain environments shift when you stay silent? How some people grow uneasy when you observe too closely? That is not imagination. It is their unconscious reacting. Jung described this phenomenon as the threat that consciousness represents to what lives hidden. Your lucidity is a trigger. You sense the atmosphere of manipulation before the request appears. You know when someone is performing confidence while feeling insecure inside. You detect rivalry behind cooperation. And while many call this oversensitivity, you know it is precise reading. The problem is not seeing too much, it is seeing too early. When you perceive envy before the attack, the lie before the story, the resentment before the explosion, you interrupt silent agreements. Groups survive on invisible pacts about what will not be mentioned, and your perception breaks those pacts simply by existing. That creates tension, even if you say nothing. Being a mirror means carrying discomfort that is not yours. It means entering places where masks fall and feeling the weight of it in the air. You did not choose to be this way, but you also cannot turn it off. And the more you try to ignore what you perceive, the stronger it returns, as if demanding recognition. Here is the part no one explains. When you see too much, you begin to be seen as a threat, even without attacking anyone. It is not about confrontation, it is about presence. Your consciousness unconsciously exposes what others try to bury. And that dynamic begins to charge a silent price within you. Because the price of being a mirror does not first appear in arguments, but in your body. In the exhaustion after a simple conversation, in the tension you carry without knowing whether it is yours or the environment's. And when perceiving too much starts to feel like a constant war, the gift stops being a gift and becomes weariness. The problem is not seeing too much. The problem is seeing without protection. When you perceive everything at once, your nervous system enters a state of constant alert. Every conversation becomes analysis. Every silence becomes suspicion. Every shift in tone triggers an internal signal. And what should be perception turns into vigilance. You leave a conversation feeling exhausted, as if you had carried physical weight. It wasn't the topic. It was the subtext. It was the effort of filtering what was said from what was felt. While others simply hear words, you process invisible layers, and that continuous reading drains your energy in a silent way. Over time, you begin to distrust even affection, not because you want to, but because you sense something behind it. A micro-expression slightly out of place, a pause before the response, an inconsistency between gesture and intention. And this constant reading creates internal tension. You don't relax, you monitor. Jung understood that when consciousness advances without integration, it can become overwhelming. Perception without psychological structure turns into overload. What was once clarity becomes mental hyperactivity. You begin anticipating conflicts before they exist, and you live as if you are always about to be attacked. This state of silent war changes your body. Tense shoulders, a tight jaw, shallow breathing. You enter environments already prepared to interpret threats, not because everything is a threat, but because you've learned that your reading rarely fails. And trusting your perception too much can become a trap. When you try to correct, explain, and prove what you perceive, something worse happens. You become a prisoner of your own vision. You start spending energy trying to convince people who still don't want to see. And every frustrated attempt reinforces the feeling of isolation. As if you are fighting the invisible alone. Perception without limits becomes a prison, because you begin to feel responsible for everything you detect. If you sensed manipulation, you want to expose it. If you noticed disrespect, you want to confront it. If you identified falseness, you want to clarify it. But not every truth needs immediate resolution. And constant action exhausts. There is a subtle difference between perceiving and reacting, but when you live on alert, that line disappears. You confuse clarity with obligation. You feel that if you don't speak, you are betraying yourself. And if you do speak, you pay the social price. So you begin oscillating between confrontation and frustrated silence. The most dangerous part is when this vigilance begins to distort your peace. You analyze every message received, every prolonged glance, every casual comment. The mind searches for patterns all the time. And although many of them are real, living in permanent threat detection creates emotional wear. Without realizing it, you begin to expect the worst. You interpret neutral signals as hidden warnings. You amplify micro-tensions. The gift of reading merges with anticipatory anxiety, not because you are wrong, but because you are exhausted. And exhaustion reduces discernment. This is the critical point. When the gift that once differentiated you begins to isolate you. When you no longer know whether you are seeing clearly or projecting accumulated fear. When every environment feels too heavy. Jung would call this a lack of integration between the superior function and inner balance. You are not becoming paranoid. You are overloaded. Your system is trying to process too much information without conscious filtering. And the more you try to control everything you perceive, the more imprisoned you feel. Because constant control is not strength. It is accumulated wear. The mistake is not in seeing. It is in believing that seeing demands immediate reaction. Not everything you capture needs to turn into confrontation. Not every inconsistency needs to be corrected. Not every disguised disrespect needs to be dismantled publicly. Sometimes maturity is choosing where not to enter. So the question is not how to stop seeing. You were not made to be blind. The real question is how to use this vision without destroying yourself. Because when perception meets strategy, the mirror stops bleeding and begins choosing where to reflect. Jung would never tell you to close your eyes. He did not treat perception as a flaw, but as a superior function that demands integration. The problem was never seeing too much. The problem was seeing without enough inner structure to sustain what you see. The turning point begins when you understand that maturity does not reduce vision. It organizes it. The first shift is simple and difficult at the same time. Observe without unloading. Not every truth needs to be spoken the moment it appears. Not every pattern needs to be exposed the instant it is detected. Mature perception learns to wait. It does not react on impulse. It chooses the moment. When you detect manipulation, your old reflex was to over-explain, confront, prove. Now the strategy changes. You reduce access. You adjust proximity. You do not debate the game. You simply step off the board. That is not weakness. It is psychological intelligence applied with conscious composure. Feeling is not a duty to fix. That sentence can free you more than any confrontation. You can perceive someone's sadness without assuming responsibility for curing it. You can identify shadow without becoming an involuntary therapist. Separating perception from obligation is the first healthy boundary. The immature being fights the shadow. The mature being stops feeding it. When they perceive disguised disrespect, they do not enter endless debate. They withdraw energy. When they sense constant inconsistency, they adjust distance. There is nothing to prove. Conscious withdrawal speaks louder than explanation. This requires what Jung called psychic discrimination. The ability to differentiate what is yours from what belongs to the other. Not every tension in the room is your responsibility. Not every absorbed emotion needs to be processed as personal. Sometimes it is simply information passing through you. Observe without internalizing. Perceive without incorporating. You can recognize envy without letting it contaminate your value. You can identify hostility without allowing it to shape your mood. The difference between suffering and using the gift lies in the inner space you learn to build. If you detected manipulation, stop explaining. If you perceived disrespect, reduce availability. If you felt something was wrong, leave early. Perception does not have to become speech. It can become silent decision. And silent decisions preserve energy. Maturity does not turn you into someone cold. It turns you into someone selective. You still see, you still feel, but now you choose where to invest attention. And attention is rare currency. Whoever receives your attention receives power over your inner state. Jung spoke of integration as the meeting between consciousness and the unconscious without war. When you stop fighting what you see, something shifts. Perception stops being a constant threat and becomes a strategic tool. You do not extinguish your sensitivity, you learn to manage it. There is a strange peace when you understand that not every battle deserves your energy. Not every inconsistency requires your intervention. Some people only learn through the impact of their own choices. And you do not need to be the messenger of every truth. By adjusting access, you begin to experience something new: lightness. The body relaxes because it is no longer in a permanent state of confrontation. The mind slows down because it does not need to monitor everything. You remain lucid, but you no longer live at war. The mature being does not try to save the world from its own unconsciousness. They choose environments where their perception is valued. They build smaller, more conscious circles. They understand that depth is not for everyone, and that is okay. You were not made to be blind, but you were also not made to be a martyr. Your gift does not have to cost you your peace. When you learn to use vision as a criterion of proximity, not as a weapon of confrontation, something powerful happens. You become untouchable. Untouchable does not mean isolated, it means stable. You perceive the shadow, but you do not react to it. You recognize the game, but you do not enter it. You identify the pattern, but you do not become emotionally entangled. Your strength shifts from confrontation to positioning, and it is at this point that the danger of seeing too much transforms into strategic advantage. You are not the problem. You never were. You simply needed to learn that vision without limits is a prison, but vision with consciousness is power. And true power does not shout. It chooses. Now you understand what once felt like nothing more than internal confusion. Your gift isolates you because you become a mirror. Your gift exhausts you when it turns into constant vigilance. And your gift becomes wisdom when it learns to transform into selection and boundaries. It is not about seeing less. It is about using better what you see. You were not born to carry everyone's shadows. You were not born to explain what others do not want to understand, nor to convince those who still prefer the mask. The mistake was never your perception. The mistake was believing it had to be proven all the time. When you try to be understood by everyone, you abandon yourself. When you try to correct every inconsistency, you exhaust yourself. But when you choose to be loyal to what you see, something shifts. The energy that once went into confrontation begins to go into positioning. And positioning is silent power. Less people, more truth, less chaos, more peace. That is the equation that turns the gift into maturity. You do not need approval from those who live comfortably on the surface. You need inner coherence. And inner coherence is worth more than any external applause. There is a huge difference between being intense and being whole. The world may continue calling your clarity exaggeration. It may label your perception as drama, but you now understand that misdirected intensity becomes wear, while conscious intensity becomes direction. You do not need to be understood by everyone. You need to be loyal to what you perceive. You need to trust the signal your body captures before the mind rationalizes. You need to respect the discomfort that appears before concrete evidence. That loyalty is what protects your sanity. And when you choose boundaries instead of confrontation, strategic silence instead of excessive explanation, something powerful happens. You stop being reactive and become selective. And selectivity is the highest form of self-control. It is not coldness. It is emotional maturity. You were not born to be a candle in someone else's hand, burning yourself to illuminate their insecurity. You were born to be a lighthouse, steady, distant enough not to be invaded, close enough to guide those who truly want to see. And lighthouses do not ask permission to shine. They simply remain.